I do. I've got one right here. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you, Lucas, for that very kind introduction. Good evening and welcome. I'm David Shipley, and I'm thrilled to be here to help celebrate the 5th anniversary of Liberties, or the 100th day of the Trump administration. We can decide as the night goes on, I think. And I hope, we've got a big group here of talkative people, so I hope people will jump in. I will move my seat accordingly so I can look at you and catch your questions. I also have passages from all of you that I will perhaps read in due course to jog the conversation along. And we'll make sure that there is time for audience questions. Leon, may we start with you, please? I want to read something you wrote from the spring 2025 issue, this one. You will have to forgive me because I have edited it slightly or trimmed it back. Some
people are going to be very happy to hear.
It's hard to stop once you've got started. This is from page 282 for folks following at home. The search for justice inexorably leads back to concepts. Don't be cruel. You added an exclamation point. But why should I not be cruel? Because it's wrong. But why is it wrong? Because it hurts people. But do you really believe in a hurtless world? Well, how would you like it if they hurt you? And just like that, we are in the severe and magical kingdom of philosophy, because we are self-interpreting beings. Sooner or later, everybody wants reasons. So let's apply this to tonight. I want you to tell us the reason for liberties. What is it, and what's it for?
Thank you, David. I just, before being caught out by someone, I just want to be clear that the phrase "and just like that" I took from Sex and the City. I want to be clear about that.
It really popped.
The rest I could give you in the original German if you'd like. I want to say before we begin that we, and I especially, am very honored that David is here with us tonight. When the roll of honor finally comes to be written about courage and capitulation in our time, David Shipley's name will be very high up as one of the earliest people who said no to interference that he believed was not consistent with the standards and the values of the profession he practices, which is journalism. And so your company enhances every room. Liberties was founded for two reasons. The second reason is in two parts. I began to have the sense during the plague, during the pandemic, but before also, and it had to do really ever since the blow-up of my late lamented weekly and then bi-weekly magazine. I know it still exists, but don't get me started. That a certain kind of intellectual discourse had been disappearing from American intellectual life. It was the discourse that used to take place in the enchanted interstices between academia and journalism. It was written by journalists, some of them. It was written by scholars, some of them. But strictly speaking, it was neither. It was not what is now called long-form journalism, which is one of the typically clinical terms with which we now, or technical terms with which we now describe things, nor is it scholarly discourse. It was the writing in the great tradition of the critique of contemporary life, contemporary affairs, on the basis of, let's just loosely call them philosophical principles. meaning that there was a larger moral or spiritual or philosophical framework within which events of the period were considered. Also, owing to the technology, whose cardinal value is speed, and by now it's beyond speed, it's simultaneity. Too many Americans that I saw were choking on hot takes and rapid responses and chyrons and the way people talk on CNN. You know, it's like the old comedians convention, number 6, haha, number 4, haha. And so I missed this discourse because I was raised on it and trained in it. So that was one reason. Also because the speedier discourse, the more up-to-the-moment discourse didn't seem to me adequate to give people what they need to understand the larger forces at work now. And God knows we are watching large forces work. Really, this is not a matter of election cycles, not in politics, not in culture, not in economics, and so on. The other reason that Liberties was founded was to provide an address for 2 causes. They've been 2 of my primary causes, but there are many people's causes. Liberties was founded to help bring about the rehabilitation of liberalism and the rehabilitation of the humanities. Those are our 2 causes. Those are our causes. By liberalism, I hasten to add, I do not mean progressivism. One of the strangest and most confusing usages in contemporary media is when progressives are called liberals and liberals are called progressives. And this is not just sectarian warfare in an age of Trump. There actually are fundamental differences, not so fundamental that we will all not vote together or did not vote together in the last presidential election. But there are important differences. I'll just give you a few so you see what I mean. For example, for progressives, and certainly since Piketty came along, capitalism is essentially, definitionally, an engine of exploitation. And there's nothing to be done about it. An alternative economic system must be imagined. Arash, I know you're really uncomfortable. Just choke on it. All right?
2 more minutes.
Yeah. Hey. So for liberals, capitalism is the best system that we have seen so far, even though it leads to exploitation and abuses. And that's why we at Liberties and many other people are a little bit fanatical on the subject of regulation. Irving Howe, the great socialist intellectual, once said to me that capitalism is the greatest economic system in the world, and I looked at him like I'd misheard, and he said, because it can be politically regulated, which means we can exert our authority upon it, and we can have wonderful debates or bitter debates, as we're having, about the extent of the regulation and so on. Progressivism believes that every projection, forgive the cliche, every use, every deployment of American power abroad is ipso facto imperialistic. Ipso facto imperialistic, that we're there to take over. I don't think that this is borne out by the history of our interventions, but liberalism, as I understand it, certainly because we're not morons, concede that American power has been responsible for many crimes and abuses abroad. There's no question about that, though by my lights, mixed results in this mortal life is actually a very good result. That's true of everything, from foreign policy to marriages. Everything. But for liberals, the United States has an obligation to help people abroad whom we have the power to help, sometimes in the name of our interests, always in the name of our values, sometimes even when we have no interests involved. And it's just different. For liberals, civil rights are a matter of universal moral values, full stop. Progressives prefer to justify civil rights with celebrations of diversity and particularity and so on, which liberals think is an early form of a kind of conformist pressure and of a vociferous effect upon American society, and so on and so on. So that was cause number one. Let me just say a word about the humanities.
Okay, a word on the humanities. And
they're great. Bye.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic.
No. What I mean by the humanities is and is not what is practiced in the university. Very few people until recently have done as much harm to the humanities as humanists. And there have to be all kinds of internecine quarrels. But the idea that you can be a thoughtful individual or a thoughtful citizen, they're not the same things, without the humanities seems to me disastrous. Disastrous because the alternative is the pandemic of quantification in which we now live. Everything, and one of the things Liberties has done and will do is not only find essays by people who understand the digital world explaining what the magnitude of its thoughtlessness and its danger is, and not that we don't use computers, I want to be clear, but also to offer some standpoint from which to resist the absurd prestige of science in realms where it does not belong. Not where it does belong. There's a difference between science and scientism. We're for science. We are not for scientism, and we think it's going to really hurt our society.
Let me just interrupt you for... Okay, oh, that's it? Okay.
Yeah,
I want to go to Celeste, because I think one of the wonderful things about you and your co-conspirator here is that, you're coming at this from very different generations. And I'm wondering, Celeste, if you agree with what Leon said, and if there's anything you'd like to add to it.
I always agree with what Leon says. Well, I think first of all, I'm very grateful to 92nd Street Y for having us, and I think Liberties exists because of institutions like this, and because of the work of people behind the scenes like Bill, our publisher, and Chris, our associate publisher, and everybody who does work because they believe that an institution like Liberties is necessary for the health of a democracy, which is correct. Leon is my teacher. He gave me the tools to rise. I wonder every day if I have the tools for it, but he certainly gave them to me, so we'll see if I know how to use them, to this exact era of human history. This is the test. When I was a kid and people asked, what would you do? We're all finding out right now what we would do. And it's a great responsibility, and I really hope that I can do honor to the traditions that he gave me. That's what I'm trying to do, really, every day.
Well, let me ask because since it has been 5 years, you guys can still probably remember some of the founding decisions. And the biggest, maybe, and this gets to what you were beginning to talk about with science and the humanities, is culture and politics, in that order. So not economics, not ideas. And actually culture and politics together, not kept separate as they were at the place that we worked, the New Republic. And maybe you guys can explain that decision and tell us if it makes more sense now. And I hope some of the others on stage will jump in because you guys need to execute that vision.
I just want to quickly say, Celeste will continue, but it says culture and politics. It could have said culture and politics and economics and religion and society and technology and so on. The one point that is profoundly important to me, it was at the old magazine, as you just pointed out, and it is at Liberties, is that we emphatically reject the synchronization of culture with politics. Culture must never...
Just tell me what that means.
That means people who regard culture as politics by other means. That means art, that is the conception of art as essentially propagandistic, or if you want, justice-seeking, if you want to be a little more highfalutin about it. I'm just now writing an essay about Trump's war on culture for the next issue, and one of the things I'm writing about is the history of the synchronization of culture with politics by, let's just call them authoritarian regimes. The question of how authoritarian we are, I don't want to get into the semantics.
Yeah.
We have bigger things to talk about. But at Liberties, we do not believe that it is the primary role of art and culture to discuss politics or policy. And we believe that, because after all, there is the fate of the soul, the fate of the community, there is the problem of being the child of two mortal human parents and dealing with that fate. I mean, there are life's questions. So I want to just be clear before Celeste continues that the separation is one of the principles of the institution.
I think the way that I understood what I was taught is that you cannot understand the period in which you live without having a cultural framework. So I'll give you an example of what I mean, and I will also say, and I'll finish with this, that Arash and I argue about this all the time. But the political universe that I'm immersed in most of all, and sort of like my political specialty, is Israel and Palestine. I cannot understand it without understanding the classics, without understanding the literature that I learned in college, that I learned in high school. I need that framework in order to absorb what I'm witnessing and to process it. So when I have conversations with friends of mine from Gaza, or from the West Bank or from Israel, and we're trying to understand what is happening, it's such a relief to us to have that conversation outside of the political vernacular that all of us are living in. I want them to understand, I'm not asking them how far left or how far right they are. I'm asking them, how do you understand what is happening to you? That's a very different question. It's not like I'm constantly taking your political temperature to try and figure out where you put yourself on this spectrum, which I will say is what most people are doing most of the time when they're having political conversations. They are not trying to understand what is literally happening. A great example is the word fascism. Do you call what's happening in America right now fascistic? That is not a question that you're asking because you're trying to understand what is happening in America right now. The reason you ask that question is because you're trying to figure out, did you vote for Bernie or did you write in? I mean, that's the reason you're asking that question. And for people who have, I have a dear friend who lost his sister and father in Gaza last year. He does not want to know who I voted for. He wants to know whether or not I consider what's happening to him horrific, right? It's a different question. And frankly, it's cheap to be having a political conversation, which is, our publisher is the one who insisted on putting culture before politics. But I do think that he was right. And I think the reason he was right is because you're trying to dignify human experience by saying what is happening to you is not primarily a question of whether or not you voted for Kamala or Trump.
Let me try and come at it a slightly different way and involve some of these folks, Arash and Sheila and Jim, and talk a little about writing they've done for Liberties. And how the journal, in a way, created a space for what they wanted to say, or how even the idea itself maybe prompted you guys to say something. I've got, so here are 3 passages, also with a little bit of editing. The first is from Arash on Iranian filmmakers. In a climate of hostility and repression, what has mattered is not what Iranian films do or say, but what they are. And what they are is a zone of freedom, shrewdly and miraculously extracted from the unfreedom that surrounds them. And this is from Sheila. Movies are a reflection of their audience, although just how might not be apparent at the time of their release. Casablanca was a hit in 1942, but there was no sense it would be a timeless classic. The film was standard patriotic fare in wartime America. But what strikes a contemporary viewer is its urgent presentation of the refugee pileup in North Africa after the fall of France and the problem of displaced people. Reflections are not always flattering, but truth asserts itself. And finally, from Jim, if the overall significance of pop culture is in deflationary decline, the claims made for the latest thing have never been more inflationary. So much entertainment coverage in the Times, the New York one, and elsewhere reads as overcompensation, an effort to will something into more than fleeting relevance. Fleeting relevance. I guess what I want to know is how do you guys and how does Liberties identify or locate the non-fleetingly relevant, also maybe known as the truth? And what do these observations say about the void that you all are trying to fill? Jump ball.
First, I should thank Leon for bringing the, well, first of all, for bringing giving a good space for a Marxist writer to write about, show his appreciation for liberal principles, and also for the identification that capitalism is the most advanced and best humans have done, which is, of course, from Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, where he said that.
John Stewart.
I was very happy with this essay, and I really thought that it had it really had a home in Liberties. And let me put it this way, because I think actually in the last few years, Iranian cinema that I wrote about has sometimes lost that way. The Iranian movies, like Abbas Kiarostami that I wrote about in the 90s and others, they were seen as oppositional in the Iran that I grew up in, i.e. they stood for everything that the regime didn't stand for. But they did so precisely by kind of not being capital P political in some ways. What was so fascinating about Abbas Kiarostami's cinema was that out of the Iran of the 80s, the Iran-Iraq War, the great ideological revolution, the one in which people had been Marxist and Islamists, had TV debates on whether the matter predates essence and dialectical materialism and all that. He tells a story of, in Where Is My Friend's House, of a couple of young boys, a young boy who would do anything to make sure that his classmate will get his notebook the day after. Not because he belongs to a particular political faction, but because he stands for some basic values. And Kiarostami is not forcing this down our throat. He is not making a very political hero of this book. And it's this, and I quote Ahmad Shamlou, the poet, important Iranian poet, who says, I'm not your enemy, I'm your negation to the regime in one of his poets. The point was that by their mere being, by showing that there's a world beyond this ideological rigidities, you can practice a sort of humanity. Now, unfortunately, I think that's actually been lost in some of the more recent Iranian cinema. The film by Mohammad Rasulov, for example, that was very widely celebrated, got a good award at Cannes, was nominated for the Oscars, which I really didn't like. Lots of respect to him, of course. He's a great hero for resisting the regime, but we should be able to speak about art freely. It's precisely because it has lost that tradition. Because it's very clear that this is a film that is against the regime, and in every scene we know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and being forced on. And I think this, if you will, the temptation of didactism is there. So I'll end by saying I think what was so wonderful about this Iranian cinema, and continues, in many good Iranian films, that can be a lesson to the world, and I think that's in fact why the Iranian cinema has been able to punch above its weight so much and have so many followers, is precisely that, is that it's not that it's not political, right? It doesn't need to force its politics in this direct way.
Is there something about the context of Liberties that enabled you to write this?
Yeah, I believe I think what Leon said is the understanding that culture, need not be politics. In fact, probably should not be politics. I mean, if you, I had the strangest experiences in the last few years in this country. I remember seeing, I'm like naming names now. I remember, seeing a film and saying that I really sort of hated it. And people were saying, but how could you? This basically gives the right message, that you agree with. And then, but if the point is to give the right message, why bother making a movie? We can just get write it in a placard and stand with it, right? So I think this understanding that there should be an aspiration for culture that is something higher than politics, I think it's very much written in every issue of Liberties, and I hope it comes across. Is that it's the question of topicalness that I think comes home tonight, right? It doesn't need to be sort of topical in a sort of a pedestrian way. Like it needs to sort of apply, it needs to sort of talk about what has happened in the last 2 weeks, right?
Sheila, Jim, do you have a response to that or want to build on it?
I was thinking all kinds of things when I was listening to you about sort of art that has, you're expected, if you're in the film critic world, there is this feeling of consensus that builds really, really fast with social media. It's like suddenly we all love this movie or we all hate this one, and if you love it, then you support ism, whatever it is that you don't want, and it becomes this kind of, you gotta have a thick skin. I don't really care, but I'm gonna like what I'm gonna like. But I feel like in terms of Liberties, I write regular reviews for RogerEbert.com, and I am assigned them, so I don't know what I'm gonna get, which is great, because then I see stuff I might not see or whatever. I had a bi-weekly column with Film Comment, which I loved. They just were like, we just like your brain, write whatever you want to write, which never happens, and then they closed their doors in the pandemic. So then this kind of opportunity came. Celeste kind of reached out to me, and I've so far I've written very different types of pieces, stuff that I've been wanting to write in some cases for decades, that have nothing to do with being pegged to the news is one thing. But I feel like I have enough of I've been doing this long enough. I mean, I did come to this kind of late, but that not everybody's gonna like me, and I'm totally fine with that. But the people who do want to hear what I have to say, so I'm gonna talk about, John Cassavetes and Jenna Rollins and my discovery of them. One of the things that I like in writers, and that, I'm not, okay, this is gonna sound ridiculous, but I'm like not educated in this stuff. I had to really teach myself. I didn't go to school for any of this stuff. I had to absorb from other writers, tell me the important markers on this cultural, and the writers who did that for me, who like little breadcrumbs of I remember in high school just being like, Godard, okay, I need to know about Godard. Apparently, I don't know, And so I would love to be that. I would love to be that. I don't want to be condescending, but I want us to be like, okay, I'm going to assume that even if you haven't seen Casablanca, maybe you read that. I mean, plenty of people haven't. I know many young people who have no idea what that is, so maybe you'd be curious about it. So I don't know. I don't even know if that's the answer, but you have to kind of stay steady and do your own thing, which is one of the things that I've loved about Liberties, is it gives me the chance to go long form and to kind of loop in whatever I want, really. You know what I mean? Like Tennessee Williams, John Cassavetes, they go together in my mind. Why is that? And let me write about that.
Well, I think there's something in what you were saying about being at a distance from the news, or being conscious about where the news is and where you are. And it seems that part of what Jim was getting at, and I will let him speak to this, in his Diddy piece, in his Times Culture piece, was the pressure of responding to the moment and amplifying things. And it seems what you've created here is a place that gives you the space not to do that. Does that seem right to you, Jim?
One of the things, I wrote for Leon at the New Republic, and one of the things is Leon never said, don't go after this person or don't go after this institution. Because, my son and his daughter are in the same class at Cornell. Which believe me, you get some of that. And it was, for example, I don't think people realize how tiptoe people are in New York about anything involving the New Yorker. They do not.
Now we're getting
They
somewhere.
don't know if somehow it'll get back to Remnick. It'll float through the air. The old days when people would sort of mock, the New York. I mean, I'm not saying people should, but we just went through their anniversary, so they had their big celebration.
Yeah.
But Leon didn't say, okay, you can't do that. And the funny thing is, there are pieces I did that I didn't put in my collection that were in the New Republic because I thought, are they too mean now? And one of them was a piece I did about Adam Gopnik. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, God, I really wish you would put that Gopnik piece in. I remember when it came out. It's really funny what people miss in terms of, with a certain kind of relish.
I think that answered the question. I really do. If anybody wants to do a follow-up, just write it on a card.
Well, I want to say something.
Yeah.
I want to say something because what he said was not negative enough. No, I'm just kidding. But there is something to be said, and it disappeared from our journalism a long time ago for various reasons. There's something to be said for negative criticism. It is an essential function of the intellect. Most people think that negative criticism is an aggression, that it's an attack on something. In fact, when it's practiced in a principled way, and nobody does it better than Jim, or in a funnier way, it's not an attack, it's a retaliation. You've read something that traduces something that you believe deeply and that you think should enjoy a higher prestige in our society or our culture. And so what you're doing is rising to the defense of a principle or a novel or a film or an idea by offering a response to an attack. And it's one of the interesting dynamics in culture is who gets the reputation as the attacker and who doesn't. And who doesn't? I mean, the New Yorker was a perfectly good example for about 3 million reasons. But there used to be a man who worked at the New Yorker, you'll all remember, or some will remember, named Jonathan Schell, who's no longer with us. And he wrote a book that was a rabid attack on the foundations of American national security. It was about nuclear weapons. But he wrote it as an but he practiced what they used to call at the New Yorker fine writing. It was just lovely to read, as if loveliness has anything to do with the substance of anything. And I remember thinking, no, too many people are going to be misled by the loveliness of his prose and will not realize that if we were to adopt the policies that he is recommending, we could make ourselves dangerously vulnerable. And I thought, we can argue about this. I'm not saying that I have the only truth, but it was important to rise up a little ferociously and to get the attention of my countrymen and to say, look, get past the fine writing, think about this. And that's my idea. When Jim writes negative criticism, it's not negative just for the fun of it, though it is a lot of fun when he writes it. It is also a defense of certain things that he's afraid of disappearing or being eliminated from the scene.
I want to come to something fierce that Sean wrote. Also lightly edited. If everything goes as they hope, the Republicans' harassment will help produce a resounding GOP victory in the 2024 elections with Trump, presumably the party's presidential nominee. Once restored, the great leader, unchecked by Congress or the courts, may be expected to pursue authoritarian, kleptocratic policies on a scale merely hinted at during his first 4 years, including a foreign policy friendlier than ever to repressive dictatorships abroad. But more than that, the Republican Party, if successful, will be poised to secure what has been its supreme political goal for a long time, long before Trump, something that the Southern slave power had hoped to achieve before the rise of the Lincoln Republicans drove it to disunion, a more or less ironclad system of undemocratic minority rule. Now, you probably heard this appeared in the autumn 2021 issue of Liberties, which
Thank
means
you very much, David.
which means you probably wrote it in the 2021 academic off-season, so the summer of 2021. And there is something about, I guess I'd like to ask, is there something about the Liberties space that allowed for this moment of history-based prescience? Because that's what it is, and ferocity.
Well, Liberties does allow me, I'm an academic historian, but it takes history seriously. History is a part of what we have to do. It's not just part of the culture, it's part of both the politics and the culture, and you can't write about either without an historical dimension. That we live in a nation that is notoriously has no historical dimension whatsoever in its understanding of the world. Just watch CNN, watch anything, there's no history there. No history. But in talking about history, we were talking before about the ways in which you cannot reduce culture to politics. But you also can't reduce politics to culture. And that's one of the things that Writing for Liberties allows me to do, is to talk about politics, not as the superstructure for something else, not as a reflection of this, that, or the other thing, but in fact it has its own reality, its own dynamic, it is there. If you combine that with history, you can figure out what's going on. That wasn't particularly prescient on my part. I don't know. I'm not trying to be falsely modest. But the fact was that if you were listening to what they were saying, and you had an understanding of what had happened in this country in the 1850s and 1860s, it was plain as day. It was plain as day. But there's so much noise out there, and people treat politics as a cultural phenomenon rather than as a political one. Liberties allows me to do that. But I have to add one other thing about Leon and negative criticism.
Yes.
You may not remember this, Leon. I wrote for the New Republic a lot. This guy made me in many, many ways. No.
That's a terrible responsibility for me to bear.
I know, right. But I remember I was writing a review of a history book, and I really didn't like this book. I really thought it was terrible. Everything about it was terrible, from the cover on. It was just bad. The blurbs were bad. Everything about it was bad.
So you didn't like it?
I didn't like it. And so I sent my draft into Leon and said, Sean, but you really have to punch this author in the nose. And the fact that the author was, like at that time, was Barbara Tuchman, who was very, very old, told me that this is important, there are no holds barred. It doesn't matter who the person is. What matters is the idea. What matters are the ideas. What matters is the politics. What matters is the culture. And to understand that in a way that's responsible means that you can't, it's not just taking the New Yorker too seriously. It's taking anything too seriously as too sacrosanct. There are no sacred cows in this journal, and we live with sacred cows all the time. And one final thing, because this goes back to the predecessor for us. Going back to Partisan Review in the old days, okay. So it was a problem of trying to figure out what the problem was with our cultural analysis, especially in the academy, right? And when I hear the word progressive, you're talking about progressives and liberals. I think of Henry Wallace, okay? I think of Henry Wallace. And Dwight MacDonald, who was in many ways a predecessor of ours, once described Henry Wallace's ideology as the fog created when the warm stream of American liberalism hits the glacier of Stalinism. That is really
Wish
true.
we had a fog machine.
Yes, he didn't.
Nice to have.
That was a good one. And today you could say in my world that often you can talk about the cultural analysis we have today is the warm currents of American liberalism hitting the iceberg of Michel Foucault. That's the fog.
Yeah.
Okay? So cutting through that fog is really what what I like most about all of this. It is a mission. And it's a sort of political mission, it's a cultural mission, but it understands how to go about it.
Yeah, Arash, you had something you want to
I
say?
just want to say, I couldn't agree more. I think this is a very important point that, when you do culture as politics, you are doing damage to culture, but also to politics, because then you're not doing politics as politics. Again, a affliction that is particularly strong in this country. When you vote for someone, you're not endorsing them in some sort of a philosophical being. Yeah. They're not your new prophet. They're your representative. A voting for someone is not some sort of a moral, deontological act. It's a consequential act, consequentialist act, right? And this is how it's practiced in any place where there are sort of established political traditions. I wrote before about the fact that, the communist parties around the world in the last, 10 years, in most countries in the world, have had no problem supporting different center-left, in fact, liberals against authoritarians. Why? Because they come from a certain tradition, a certain political tradition, which made it clear there are alliances, there's a reason you do politics. There is a idiom to politics, a methodology to politics that is taken away if everything you do is like, it is this, honestly, I never felt as sick as living here during the pandemic, where whether you wear a mask or not was a sign of sort of political choice. What insanity is this? If we need to wear masks, it should be because it's sort of medically necessary. and then I had friends who, consider, you ordered food from outside, this was like eugenics. And then of course, until then, that some protest happened, so everybody was outside and that was fine. The same people, right? So I think it really damages politics. It doesn't just damage culture, which it surely does, but it damages politics when you don't do it as politics in its own ways, by its own methodologies, and by its own logic.
Celeste, you had?
Yeah, I was reminded of something when Arash was talking. I have another friend also from Gaza who's 30 members of his family were killed. He got out early. He got out right before the war. And when he got here, progressives, he lives in Brooklyn, poor man, and progressives said to him, he got out of Gaza, and he hates Hamas because Hamas led his entire family to slaughter. And progressives said to him, how could you leave? How could you leave? You have to go back. And he was like, you go.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and one thing that I think I've noticed and that I've learned from everybody on this stage, including you, is I don't want to have to write what I think my readers will like. My readers are not in my head while I'm writing. What's in my head while I'm writing is, am I understanding the thing that I am looking at? And that is what Leon has taught me, and what I am always trying to do with my writers is asking them, I don't care what your friends are gonna say at the bar about what you wrote for us. I wanna know what you think. Your education was to tell me how to understand with your mind what you're looking at. That's what Liberties is asking. And I think, and I don't hate the New Yorker as much as everybody else on the stage. I think that institutions that are dedicated to culture are important, and I'm grateful for them. However, every other publication that I know of does require writers to peg their writings to something that has just happened so that it can be relevant. And I was taught that the most important, the most salient part of whatever it is that we're publishing is what this brain, which we have deemed exceptional enough to teach us, has noticed about the thing that it is writing about. That is all that matters. And that's what we're doing here.
I just want to, I agree with every word my colleague said. I just want to say that in connection with what we've been talking about here, there are two words that we need to think more critically about at this moment. The first is civility, and the second is polarization. Civility is a lovely thing. It is primarily a social virtue. It is not necessarily an intellectual virtue. The battle of ideas, or as we used to call it, the B of I.
B of I index.
It is not for the faint-hearted. It just isn't. It just isn't, for many reasons. some of it having to do with the price that certain intellectuals who paid in various other countries, and not the same sort of prices, but some intellectuals in our country may soon find themselves paying some version of. Civility is all very nice, but when there's an emergency, and we now wake up every morning, however you want to define it, we wake up every morning to a national and an international emergency. It is the norm. It is not. There's nothing. It's not the deviation. Civility doesn't. I mean, I get a certain pleasure in conversations sometimes at being mean, but this is not. Thinking is not a social activity. Except I know the philosophers will tell you blah blah blah, but this is not. Except, of course, at the Aspen Ideas Festival, where it's nothing but a social activity. The second word, the second word, polarization. The problem with them, and this is something I learned from talking and reading Sean in the last decade. The problem that ails us is not that we are bitterly divided. We were built to be bitterly divided. This kind of bitter division is written. Madison foresaw that conflict would be an immutable feature of human affairs, and certainly of political affairs. We don't have a national dream the way the French do of a general will, of perfect unanimity, of some magical consensus, quite the contrary. And if polarization gets bitter, that comes with that is owed to the magnitude of the stakes that are involved here. We do suffer from things that are mistaken for polarization. For example, over-politicization. We have surrendered the entirety of our consciousnesses and our lives to politics, and that hurts politics. We have become a nation of religious thinkers about non-religious subjects, in which the more extreme and devout the expression of a proposition, the truer it must be. The truer it must be. The intensity, the heat vouches for the light. And this is terrible. But we must stop fearing this conflict, and we must stop, every time, I love him, but every time I get, which is 3 times a day, a fundraising email from Cory Booker, and he ends with the word love, I just want to throttle him.
But then
no, not love, not love. There's a fight.
And there's a fight, as you guys have alluded to, around the limits of discourse. Yeah. And what is, and lots of people and institutions, including the one we are at tonight, have struggled with this. Many of us know people who have worked through, many of us have encountered this in our own lives. And, Israel-Palestine has been a particularly hard place. I want to read this passage from an essay, from your essay that we started with. And the American Jews. How long will we applaud our brothers and sisters in their short-sightedness? I would have thought that the telling of truth, however unpleasant, is also an expression of solidarity. Does the magnitude of the destruction in Gaza really not trouble the sleep of the majority of American Jews? I think I know the answer. And so I wish to reassure my brethren that humaneness is not a surrender to Hamas. We need to know more than our own righteousness. We have many obligations to the Jewish state, and one of them is to keep our consciences intact. This is it's a question for now. It's a question for the next 5 years. How do you guys negotiate and accommodate dissent? How do we process the stuff we disagree with, even though we need to read it? Madison accounted for it in the Federalists. How do you guys account for it?
Dissent is a very complicated and noble phenomenon. In this country, so far, it doesn't require a great deal of courage. In this country, so far, if you say something that someone doesn't like, and I say so far, it's beginning to take on dimensions of courage that really are a disgrace to us. You know, what did Brecht say? A pity the society that needs heroes. You know, but until now, if you know, and from my own experience, I learned this, if you say something that the majority of your community doesn't like, you don't get invited to dinner. There are some people that really bothers. There are others it doesn't. I think that October 7th traumatized the entire Jewish people, genuinely traumatized them. It traumatized the entire citizenry of Israel, and not just Jews, some Arab Israelis too, I'm sure, were shaken by what was happening and then about to happen. And we have to respect that. But one of the things we have to do is push back, and by the way, this goes for other aspects of American culture. We have to push back against the moral and cultural supremacy of trauma. Trauma is one of those words that stops conversation. And what happened in Israel, after, then the war started after whatever they invaded some weeks later, and then we know what happened since. And it's been a heartbreak any way you cut it. I mean, it just is. But one of the things I thought most about was whether it is possible to imagine something that you could call post-traumatic rationality. Because on the one hand, nothing dispels reason and rational thinking the way trauma does. And it's perfectly understandable. I mean, it's really plain. On the other hand, in the immediate and midterm aftermath of trauma, nothing is more necessary for a traumatized community or people than a level head. And part of the pain of that period for me was to try to figure out, A, if a post-traumatic level head is possible, and B, if it is, what would it look like? What would it look like? One always has to dignify other people's feelings of pain. That is a cardinal principle. You do not make light of other people's pain, and especially, of course, if it's your pain too. On the other hand, pain must never have the last word, even for hospital patients. It must never have the last word. And so what I try to do in my writings about this crisis, which is going to it's not an event, it's an era, in the way that Trump is not an event, it's an era, is try to explain, to make some distinctions, and to see if we cannot contain certain emotions. October 7th triggered, if you'll pardon the expression, some very ugly feelings on the parts of all the communities that were involved. Perfectly understandable, some of them perfectly deplorable. And so one has to, not even gently, I think that the American Jewish community has been too, the word I'm going to say is sheep-like. You know, when I was growing up, and Sean will remember this, we grew up in similar intellectual circumstances. The thing not to be, the model for an intellectual, how not to behave, were the communists. Because every time Moscow changed the party line, they woke up the next day and just parroted it. Sorry, Arash. And there are times when the somnambulistic, automatic, reflexive solidarity that I see among my brothers and sisters for Israel, which I share. Israel is one of my two countries. I share it. There are times when they remind me of what I couldn't stand about fellow travelers and Popular Front people, and it's just, for God's sake, I know the party line has changed, but what do you think?
And that gets to the question of how do you cover and write about ongoing traumas. I want to read something that Celeste wrote and then maybe have Celeste talking and everybody else chip in. But perhaps every generation gets their chance to learn that the cruelties we read about in history classes were committed by human beings like ourselves. The worst monsters do not live under beds or in our imaginations. They sit in paneled offices behind mahogany desks, signing bills into law, raising and raising cities with the same hand. Each new day freshly demands a strong stomach, and maybe mine should be stronger. But the bloodshed and the appetite for it that I have watched flow so freely over portions of the globe about which I care deeply, it makes me nauseous. I hope it always does. That nausea will save us. I think maybe we should discuss the nausea for a second and how you convey it without inducing nausea. I'd be interested if there are different views on how to be consistently persuasive and engaging about really urgent and upsetting things. And why don't we start with you, Celeste?
I think that when we see something horrific happen, and now we see horrific things happening every single day on our phones, we see videos and photos of horror, which is not how human beings have historically lived. It should shock us. And the response generally is to wait until somebody has explained to us what we've seen, which is what most of the publications and news anchors exist to do. They exist to transform something incomprehensible into something comprehensible that you can read and understand. Almost everything we have lived through historically in the last year or 2 years, the way that we understand it is how the New York Times, news notification that told us what happened, which is not what happened, or whatever publication you read. I'm trying so hard to preserve the horror and really just to trust my own mind and the minds that I know can explain to me what it is that I've just seen. It's a shame that the blip that was the generation my parents grew up in ended before, I became a parent and I inherited the responsibility of leadership. Or maybe it never did, and whatever, we just happen to be aware of it now. But there are horrors being committed every day that I need my wits about me to understand, not the solidarity of the entire social circle that I inhabit, but just my wits. And I think that...
And not only in Gaza, right?
Definitely right
Right.
here.
Right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know you know that. I just wanted to say that.
Well, I'm talking about the United States right now.
I see, okay.
But if you want to talk about Gaza,
No,
we can do that all
I
day.
don't. I mean, I wanted to,
I know.
There's Ukraine and there's Sudan, and I mean, we're
I was
all-
thinking of Sudan at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of trouble in the world. Yeah,
Will we write about all of... Yeah.
challenging you.
Anytime, Leon.
Editorial meeting going on here.
It's fantastic. Let's.
I think...
And I just, this
Yeah.
is, again, I write about, movies and it's a little bit of a different thing, but I do think it's connected in the mind